At this time, I am going to introduce our next panelist and have her speak to a topic and also engage with Dr. Davis as well. So if we could spotlight Paloma McGregor, please. All right. So Paloma McGregor is a Caribbean-born, New York-based choreographer and arts leader. As co-founder and artistic director of Angela's Pulse, McGregor has spent more than a decade centering Black voices through collaborative, community-specific performance projects. A former newspaper editor, McGregor brings a choreographer's craft, a journalist's urgency, and a community organizer's framework in the service of big visions. The daughter of a fisherman and public school art teacher, McGregor amplifies and remixes the quotidian choreographies of Black folks, often in battle public spaces. McGregor's work situates performers and witnesses at the embodied intersection of the ancestral past and an envisioned future. For her, tradition transcends time. Paloma also facilitates technique, creative process, and community engagement workshops around the world. She toured internationally for 6 years with Urban Bush Women and 2 years with Liz Lerman Dance Exchange, and she continues to perform in project-based work, including Skeleton Architecture, an acclaimed collective of Black women improvisers with whom she received a coveted New York Dance and Performance Bessie Award for performance in 2017. Alongside her choreographic work, McGregor founded Dancing While Black, a platform for community building, intergenerational exchange, and visibility among Black dance artists whose work, like hers, doesn't fit neatly into boxes. Welcome, Paloma McGregor. We're very happy to have you with us.
Thank you. I was really honored to hear the speakers who've come before me and humbled to be here.
Well, we are pleased to have you here and are looking forward to your perspectives, particularly as we learn about your performative spaces and the reaching out through your artwork. So what strategies, Paloma, can you share with us for developing your approach to social justice? And if you would move us into both your individual as well as your organizational experiences, please.
Sure. I think one thing that's been key for me is that my road, if we're talking about new pathways, the pathways that I'm carving out or clearing were certainly pathways that I encountered that others, my pathway has intersected with the work of many others who have come before me. And that's been a key part of the work that I do in terms of thinking about the ways in which dance in particular, I'll say, operates sometimes skewed toward particular generations, particularly modern dance or concert dance. And so thinking about the ways in which working intergenerationally in an embodied practice allows us to see the ways in which wisdom shows up in our bodies over time, and that the actions of a 70-year-old are actually not actions that I, as a 46-year-old, can inhabit because I have not yet lived them. So that's been a big part of the work that I've both inherited and continue to do. I'll say a couple of things about the work that we're doing at Angela's Pulse. One is that Dancing While Black was founded as something that I needed. I was coming from a history of going to a historically Black college and then moving into a space where I was held and guided and also got to inhabit my own sense of truth-telling and warriorship as a community practice within urban bushwomen. And then as a dancer, you eventually may leave a company, and the New York City landscape, I'll say, is quite challenging in terms of community building among your fellow artists, because the institutions would have us think that we are in competition with one another rather than in community with one another. And so I think some of the ways in which Dancing While Black and my choreographic work have allowed me to move away from those paradigms is through understanding the ways in which racism impacts me and my own internalized notions of myself in relationship to other Black folks, the ways in which it's embedded within all of our arts institutions, and the ways in which arts institutions can actually be quite creative at racism. And so looking at that as even our most progressive institutions rely on racism and the related capitalism and patriarchy, ableism and heteronormativity, transphobia and ageism. You know, these isms are embedded within the structures that I was groomed within, and their systems, their practices, their physical spaces even, and the histories that they choose to name. And all of these isms are internalized by those folks who run them, who work for them, and folks who look to them as a resource. And so trying to create Angela's Pulse as a space in which we try to see ourselves in comradeship, and even across, and think of ourselves as a space for sharing resources. Think of ourselves as a space for moving beyond the kind of hollow equity, diversity, and inclusion rhetoric, which I think has become quite pervasive in our arts field, but is often just on paper and is rarely put into deep practice. We're working toward envisioning what liberation might look like for ourselves, particularly embodied performers whose labor cannot be directly separated from our physical selves, and trying to figure out ways in which we can assert our agency. We're also looking at the ways in which, I'm sifting through my notes a bit, but to make sure I'm staying with you, but also I'm listening as we go. Looking at the ways in which our team and our communities kind of shared analysis around racism and the way it impacts each of us can be more of an example within a broader field where when you bring up racism, there's a pause. We now have a president-elect who has named systemic racism as a core part of his platform. So really there's not an excuse to ignore that this is pervasive within our arts field. And even within arts organizations that would call themselves progressive. We have a lot of questions within our community, and I'll say that's where I'll center, and maybe where I'll pause is when folks really start to understand the systemic arrangement, the ways in which racism comes into play, start to have a shared language and analysis of racism, and maybe a clarity even about how to practice anti-racism. What are they really willing to do about it? You know, as my friends in New Orleans would say, talk that shit, now roll with it. So, you know, are white leaders and institutions willing to give up hoarded material resources that have historically and disproportionately propped their institutions up? Space, money, jobs, attention. Are foundations willing to make themselves irrelevant, to set up Black, Indigenous, immigrant, queer, disabled organizations and communities with endowments of our own? Are presenters and artists willing to submit to transformative justice methodologies as we repair generations of harm done in the name of art. You know, my comrades and I are listening, but we're not waiting. You know, we'll continue to focus on our work, on building community, on holding one another accountable, on setting some of our own languages to define our own work. You know, community specific for me comes out of a journey from site specific, which, you know, I was trying to carve more space for Black folks to say, we do site specific work. And then site, as a daughter of a colony, actually felt too colonial, that language. And so we also have to be willing to adapt, to harness the languages that are maybe available for us at the time, and also remember that we have been creating our own languages for some time to define the work that we're actually doing, and to kind of lean into that. You know, the pathways that exist for making our way, paved though they may be for some of us, have never felt voluminous enough for me and my folks, and our visions for ourselves in the world. So we want access to those roads if we choose to drive them. But we also have machetes to make pathways of our own and cut things away that no longer serve us. And I think that's a constant sort of practice for us, reminding ourselves of what assets we have together, reminding ourselves of the core values and the ways in which anti-racism plays a big part in setting those core values, and then to continue to do the work to mirror ourselves as an ecosystem, and really think about the ways in which we live in symbiosis. Me as a leader in my institution, to start to think of ways in which I can continue to kind of decentralize my position within even this institution that I co-founded, and to think about the ways that I can continue to embody this idea that and this practice that if my ecosystem is thriving, I too am thriving, and that's where I should be putting my attention and energy and resources, not into building up my own sort of positionality within the field, which is what we're encouraged to do, but to think about the ways in which actually, if we're all doing better, then we are all doing better.
Here. Thank you so much, Paloma. And I just want to make sure that I'm staying on pace, but I want to bring in a few things that you're saying there about the access to pathways, about whether or not we want to move along those pathways. We will decide that. So Dr. Davis, I just want to bring up a few of our arts movements that some of us may know about very, very well, and some of us may be hearing about them for the first time. Certainly everyone's heard of the Harlem Renaissance, the Chicago Black Renaissance, BAM, the Black Arts Movement, maybe some more or less about Afro-Cobra. But as I listened to Paloma and we realize the centrality of the arts in our lives, but sometimes not the real strength that comes from that, how do you still see, if you will, the arts as being those spaces for radical change that we're seeking?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the presentation, Paloma. Art is so central to our efforts to transform the world. You know, art actually is a transformative process, and in a sense, it helps us to understand what it is we have to do in relation to social reality. And you know, I often like to point out that artists often give us the opportunity to feel what we do not yet know how to say. And in that sense, art should be in the leadership of our movements, because it provides the light. It directs us, you know, often on paths that we don't yet know how to carve out with the traditional with the traditional tools of the activist or the intellectual. And so I think that one of our goals during this period is to recognize how essential art is, not only to our survival, but to our capacity to move forward. Oftentimes, the arts are placed lower down on the hierarchy, or people assume that it's the space where we get to experience a kind of relief, and of course, there is that. There is beauty and joy and all of that, but there's also knowledge in art. And one of the things I continue to remind myself is that the very meaning of the struggle for Black liberation all over this hemisphere has consisted not so much in the ways in which Black people have been subject to terrible ways of repression, terrible forms of repression and violence, and we know that that has been the case. We think about slavery, we usually think about all of the punishments that are related to slavery. But what is so important about the Black liberation movement is not only the fact that we have survived that repression, but rather that we have also learned how to create and to produce beauty within a process designed to dehumanize Black people. And in a sense, that has demonstrated that the very notion of humanity and democracy is so central to the Black presence, largely because of that role of creativity and art and beauty and music. And so I find myself feeling that we're all guided by art and that we have to recognize that. And as I said before, we have to recognize that oftentimes we feel, we're given the opportunity to feel something before we actually figure out how to understand it, how to know it.
Thank you so much, Paloma and Dr. Davis. And I was looking in the chat and someone said we are all guided by art. So thank you all for those beautiful renderings.